It was a cold, foggy evening when Mark found himself standing outside the Horizon Diner, an old restaurant that had only recently opened its doors in the heart of a forgotten part of the city. Mark was a food critic, always on the hunt for the best and most unique dining experiences, but this place seemed different. The tall, weathered sign hanging above the door barely swayed in the wind, as if it had been there for decades. Yet, the place was brand new, only opening a few weeks ago. The building itself was an enigma. From the outside, it looked like it belonged to another era, a place that time had long since forgotten. The walls, a dull gray, were almost completely covered by vines, as though the restaurant had been abandoned for years. The windows were large and fogged over, but Mark could still make out the faint flicker of lights inside. As he stepped through the door, a small bell rang, signaling his arrival. The interior was just as odd as the exterior. The air was thick with an unsettling stillness, broken only by the soft hum of a distant, almost inaudible melody playing from somewhere inside. The lights were dim, casting long, eerie shadows across the checkered floor. The tables, each uniquely set, seemed to be untouched by time, with vintage tablecloths and brass candle holders on each one. It was as though he had stepped into another era, far removed from the city's bustling streets. "Welcome to Horizon Diner," came a voice from behind him. Mark turned to see a young woman, maybe in her 20s, standing by the entrance. She was dressed in a crisp, old-fashioned uniform, like something out of the 1950s. Her eyes were cold, but there was something oddly inviting about her presence. "Please take a seat wherever you'd like," she continued, a hint of a smile playing on her lips. Mark nodded, still taken aback by the place's odd charm. He chose a table near the window, one that provided a view of the foggy street outside. The only sound now was the soft clinking of silverware and the hushed murmurs of the few patrons scattered throughout the diner. As he sat down, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The other diners, who seemed like they had been there for hours, all sat eerily still, their faces blank, as if they were waiting for something. One elderly man sitting at the table closest to him stared into his cup of coffee without blinking, his hands shaken slightly. A few minutes passed before the waitress returned with a menu. Her movements were graceful, but there was an air of mechanical precision to them, as if she had performed the same task 1,000 times before. She placed the menu on the table with a soft thud, and Mark glanced at it. The dishes seemed strange. Some of the items didn't make sense, while others were familiar, but with odd twists. Purgatory soup, soul creme brulee, eternal ribeye. Mark raised an eyebrow, but didn't think too much of it. After all, every diner had its quirky dishes, right? "Can I take your order?" she asked, her voice soft but unsettling. Mark could feel her eyes on him, waiting for him to make a choice. He ordered something simple, a classic dish he was familiar with: a steak, medium rare, and a side of fries. As the waitress turned to leave, Mark noticed the peculiar atmosphere again. The other diners seemed to be watching him, their eyes cold and distant. It was as if they knew something he didn't. Something in the air felt heavy, like it was saturated with secrets just waiting to be uncovered. Just as he was about to turn his attention back to the menu, a man sitting across the room caught his eye. He was well dressed, with a sharp suit and a stern expression. But there was something wrong about him. His face looked like it was partially frozen, almost as if he was trapped in a moment of horror. The man's eyes were wide, but his gaze seemed empty, as if he was staring at nothing at all. Mark felt a chill run down his spine. Without warning, the man's eyes shifted toward him, locking onto Mark's with an intensity that made his heart race. For a moment, time seemed to slow, and Mark could feel an oppressive weight in the air. He blinked, and in that instant, the man's face contorted into a grotesque smile. A smile that didn't belong on a human face. It was like something out of a nightmare, twisted and unnatural. The waitress reappeared, interrupting Mark's thoughts. She placed his meal in front of him, without a word, and turned to leave, her eyes lingering on him for a moment too long. Mark, still shaken by the man's gaze, glanced down at his plate. The steak was cooked to perfection, just as he had ordered. But there was something odd about the way it shimmered under the dim light. He took a bite, not knowing what to expect. But as soon as the meat touched his tongue, a rush of coldness flooded his senses. It was as if the very act of eating it drained the warmth from his body. The flavor was unlike anything he had ever tasted. Rich, deep, and yet strangely metallic, as if it had been marinated in something otherworldly. Mark tried to ignore the sensation, but it gnawed at him. His throat tightened and his chest constricted. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a bell ringing softly. Mark looked up, but this time, the door didn't open. The bell rang again as if someone were walking past it, but the door remained still. He could see that all the other patrons had stopped eating. They were watching him again, their eyes fixed on his every movement. Suddenly, the lights flickered. The hum of the music grew louder, as if it was closing in on him. His breath became shallow as an overwhelming sense of unease flooded his chest. Mark had been to hundreds of restaurants in his career, but none had ever made him feel like this. There was something profoundly wrong about the Horizon Diner. Something dark and sinister lingered just beneath the surface. And just as quickly as it had begun, the moment passed. The lights steadied. The music softened. The patrons returned to their meals, as if nothing had happened, but Mark couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. As Mark continued to eat his meal, trying to push away the unsettling thoughts that plagued his mind, the eerie atmosphere of the Horizon Diner began to gnaw at him. He looked around, noticing that not only were the patrons quiet and unblinking, but they were all eating in sync, as if they were following an unspoken rule. No one spoke. No one moved too much, except for the faint clink of silverware against plates. Mark took another bite of his steak, but this time, he couldn't ignore the metallic taste that lingered longer than it should. His throat felt dry and he reached for his glass of water, desperate to wash away the strange sensation. But as he brought the glass to his lips, his hand shook involuntarily. He looked down only to find the water in his glass rippling, as though there was an invisible force pushing against it from the inside. His pulse quickened. He tried to brush it off as a trick of the mind, but the unease he felt was palpable. The air itself seemed heavier now, pressing in on him from all sides. He glanced over at the elderly man from earlier, the one who had been staring into his coffee for what felt like hours. The man's eyes were no longer unfocused, but piercing, fixed on Mark with an unnerving intensity. His lips trembled, as if he was trying to speak, but couldn't find the words. Mark quickly turned away, his stomach tightening. He needed to get out of here. He couldn't explain it, but something about this place felt suffocating, like it was alive in a way that shouldn't be possible. He had heard rumors of strange places in the city, hidden restaurants that catered to people who craved the bizarre and the unusual, but he had never believed them. Now, he wasn't so sure. Suddenly the lights flickered again, this time more violently. The hum of the background music became erratic, almost like static. For a moment, the room seemed to warp, the walls stretching and bending, warping like they were being sucked into a void. The other patrons, as if on cue, stopped eating and turned their heads slowly towards Mark. Their faces were frozen in a bizarre mixture of curiosity and hunger. Mark's heart raced as he stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. The room seemed to darken around him, the air thickening with an invisible presence. He felt a cold draft brushing against his neck, and a voice, low, almost inaudible, whispered from somewhere behind him. "Leave. Now." Mark's body froze. He spun around, but no one was there. The restaurant was silent again, the patrons unmoving. He looked towards the door. It was still shut, the bell hanging motionless, and yet the sound of it ringing again echoed in his mind. The strange voice lingered in the air, as though it had been spoken through the walls. "Get out," he heard again, louder this time. The whisper was tick seemed to come from every direction at once, surrounding him. The cold air turned bitter, like ice forming around his skin, as the shadows in the room deepened. Without thinking, Mark bolted for the door. He stumbled, his legs unsteady, as if the ground beneath him was shifting. His chest tightened with every step, his breath coming in short, ragged bursts. As he neared the door, he reached for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Yanked at it again, panic rising within him. It was as though the door itself had sealed shut, trapping him inside. His heart was hammering in his chest as he frantically looked around the room. The patrons were still watching, their eyes unblinking, and their faces twisted into strange, distorted smiles. A few of them even began to sway slightly in their seats, as though they were caught in some strange trance. "Help!" Mark shouted, his voice cracking, but his words fell flat in the thick, suffocating air. No one reacted. No one moved. It was as if the whole diner had become a lifeless shell, with him trapped at its center. Mark stepped back from the door, trying to think. What was happening? Why wasn't anyone helping him? His mind raced as he scanned the room for an escape. That's when his eyes fell upon the elderly man again, the one who had been staring into his coffee. The man's mouth was now wide open, but he wasn't speaking. Instead, he was making low, gurgling noises, as if he was trying to get something out, but nothing was coming out of his throat. Mark took a hesitant step forward, feeling an inexplicable urge to help the man. He approached slowly, his feet heavy, as if the floor was pulling him towards the strange figure. The man's eyes were wide, the whites showing all around his pupils, and his fingers twitched erratically. Mark reached out, trembling, and placed a hand on the man's shoulder. At that moment, the man's head snapped to the side, his neck twisting at an unnatural angle. The sound of cracking bones filled the air, and the man's body went limp. But his eyes, they stayed open, locked onto Mark's, filled with pure terror. "Don't. Stay." The man's voice rasped, but it wasn't his voice. It was as if something else had taken over him, speaking through him. Mark's breath caught in his throat. The lights flickered again, this time much longer. The music that had been playing now sounded distorted, like it was being played backwards. The air turned even colder, and the shadows in the room stretched impossibly long, creeping along the floor like living things. It felt like the walls themselves were closing in. "Get out," the voice repeated. But it wasn't just the man now. It was coming from everyone in the room. The diners, still sitting motionless, were now all whispering the same words in unison. "Get out, get out, get out." Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he looked around, his vision beginning to blur. Panic gripped him as he tried again to open the door, but it remained immovable. The strange whispering voices grew louder, as though the walls themselves were alive, suffocating him. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the whispers stopped. The room fell silent. The lights returned to normal, and the hum of the music resumed its faint melody. Mark stumbled back from the door, gasping for air. He couldn't understand what had just happened. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of the impossible situation he had found himself in. He turned toward the table where he had been sitting, only to see something that made his blood run cold. The plate of steak he had been eating was now empty. No remnants of food remained, only an eerie dark stain on the plate. And sitting on the edge of the table was a small note, written in elegant, flowing handwriting. "Once you taste, you can never leave." Mark felt his stomach turn. He turned back to the door, only to find that the way out was now blocked by a dark figure standing in the doorway. The figure was tall, cloaked in shadows, its features obscured by the dim light. The figure raised a hand, pointing directly at him. "Stay," it hissed, its voice deep and unnatural. Mark's heart raced as the figure in the doorway stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate, like something that was not quite human. The shadowy form lingered at the threshold, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness, like two orbs of fire in an endless void. Mark's instinct screamed at him to run, to escape whatever this thing was, but his legs refused to move. It was as though his body was frozen in place, paralyzed by an overwhelming sense of dread. The figure's hand continued to point at him, the bony finger trembling slightly, as if it was trying to decide whether or not to strike. Mark opened his mouth to scream, to cry for help, but the words caught in his throat, smothered by the oppressive silence that hung in the air. The room around him felt more confined, the walls pressing in as though the very building was alive, breathing and watching. "Stay," the figure whispered again, its voice like a low growl. The sound sent shivers down Mark's spine. Mark tried to move, to take a step back, but his body refused to obey. His eyes darted to the diners who had been sitting motionless, staring at him with their empty eyes, their faces frozen in those strange, unsettling expressions. But now, they weren't just watching him. They were watching the figure in the doorway, their faces twisted into grotesque masks of fear, as though they were trapped in some unseen nightmare they could not escape. "Don't try to run," the figure continued, its voice now echoing through Mark's mind, not just in his ears. "You are already part of it." The words reverberated like a haunting chant, each syllable sinking deeper into Mark's consciousness. He wanted to scream, to protest, but the words wouldn't come. It was as though the air itself was thickening, suffocating him, and his thoughts became a jumble of confusion and terror. The figure stepped fully into the room, and for the first time, Mark could see it clearly. The cloak it wore was ragged, torn at the edges, and its skin was an unnatural shade of grey, stretched tight over bones that seemed far too large for its body. The eyes, those glowing orbs, seemed to burn with an intensity that felt like they were staring right through him, into the very depths of his soul. Mark's breath hitched as the figure slowly extended its hand, palm up towards him. The fingers curled in an almost inviting gesture, as if beckoning him to come closer. "Come with me," it said, its voice softer now, almost coaxing. "You will never leave, but you will understand. You will join us, as the others have." The words hung in the air like an inescapable fog, and Mark's pulse quickened. He wanted to move, to run, to do anything, but it felt like an invisible force was holding him back. The figure's presence was suffocating, like a dark cloud enveloping him, draining the very life out of the room. I don't understand," Mark finally managed to croak, his voice hoarse with fear. The figure tilted its head, its glowing eyes narrowing slightly. "You don't need to understand. You only need to obey." A chill ran down Mark's spine as the figure took another step toward him, its fingers still outstretched. The air around them seemed to shimmer, as though reality itself was warping, bending under the weight of this creature's power. Suddenly, there was a loud crash from behind him. Mark spun around, his eyes wild with panic, to find that the once immovable door had now swung wide open, as though it had never been locked in the first place. A rush of cold wind blasted into the diner, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of decay. Mark's heart pounded in his chest. This was his chance. He could escape. He could run out into the night and never look back. But as his legs moved, the figure's voice rang out again, deep and resonant. "Do you think you can outrun it?" The figure sneered, its voice full of disdain. "This place is no ordinary restaurant. It is not bound by the rules of your world. You will never leave." Mark hesitated. His instinct screamed at him to flee, but something held him in place. He turned toward the open door, his body moving on autopilot, his gaze flicking between the figure in the doorway and the door that now stood ajar. The other diners, their faces blank and expressionless, began to stand in unison, their movements slow but purposeful. Their eyes, once filled with fear, were now empty, hollow shells devoid of any emotion. They all turned towards Mark, their faces twisted into grim smiles as they began to shuffle toward him. A voice broke through the cacophony of dread in Mark's mind. It was faint at first, barely a whisper, but it grew louder with each passing moment. It was the voice of the elderly man, the one who had warned him earlier. The man's face flashed in Mark's mind, his eyes wide with terror as he had begged Mark to leave. "Don't stay. It feeds on fear. It needs you to stay. Don't be like them." The words burned through Mark's consciousness like a beacon of light in the darkness. He didn't know what it meant, but he knew one thing for certain. The people in this diner weren't like normal people. They weren't alive, not in the way he understood. They were something else, something that had become part of this place, bound to its cursed existence. Mark looked back at the open door, and for a fleeting moment, he considered running. But deep down, he knew the truth. This place was not a simple diner. It was a trap, a prison that fed on the souls of those who entered. No one who came here ever left. They either became part of the horror or vanished, consumed by the darkness lurking within its walls. The figure in the doorway stepped closer, and Mark could feel the coldness of its presence wrapping around him. The diners behind him continued their slow, unnatural march, their eyes locked onto him as if they were waiting for something. "You will stay, Mark," the figure said, its voice now cold and final. "You are already part of it, and once you are part of it, there is no escape." Mark's breath came in sharp gasps as he turned back to the door. He knew he had no choice. He had to run, had to fight for his life. But the figure's words echoed in his mind, and the realization sank in like a heavy weight on his chest. There was no escape. The air in the diner grew thick, suffocating. Mark's vision blurred as the figure's voice reverberated through his mind, drowning out everything else. And then, in a final desperate act, Mark made his choice. He ran. But as he did, the door slammed shut behind him, the sound of it reverberating like a death knell. Mark looked around, his heart pounding in his chest, only to find himself standing in the middle of a vast, empty void. The diner was gone, and in its place, there was only darkness. Mark's heart pounded violently in his chest as he stood alone in the vast, empty void. The door had slammed shut behind him with such force that it shook the very air around him. The silence that followed was oppressive, like the calm before a storm, and the weight of it pressed down on him, suffocating him with a sense of doom. The cold that had once lingered in the diner now enveloped him completely, crawling into his skin, freezing him from the inside out. He glanced around, his eyes wide with panic, but there was nothing to see. No walls, no floor, just an endless blackness that stretched out in all directions, swallowing up whatever little light there was. It was as if the diner had never existed, as though he had stepped into a world where reality itself had been torn apart, leaving him stranded in an unending void. His breaths came in shallow gasps, and for a moment he wondered if he had somehow died, if this place was some twisted afterlife where lost souls were condemned to wander forever. The thought sent a shiver down his spine, but he quickly dismissed it. He couldn't afford to give in to fear now. He had to find a way out. He had to escape. But how? The figure, the creature that had appeared in the doorway, had told him there was no escape. It had made it clear that he was trapped, that he was part of the diner's curse now. Its words echoed in his mind, a constant reminder of the hopelessness that surrounded him. You are already part of it, and once you're part of it, there is no escape. Mark's hands trembled as he wiped the cold sweat from his forehead. He clenched his fists, trying to summon the courage to keep moving forward. There had to be a way out. Suddenly, a flicker of light appeared in the distance, so faint it was almost imperceptible, but it was enough to catch Mark's attention. His eyes locked onto it, and instinctively he began to walk toward it, his legs moving of their own accord, despite the heaviness in his chest. With each step the light grew stronger, and the darkness around him seemed to recede just a little, though it never fully disappeared. As he approached the light, he could make out shapes in the distance, figures standing motionless. Mark's stomach churned with dread, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. Something urged him forward, like an invisible force pulling him toward them. When he finally reached the figures, he realized they were the diners, the same ones who had sat at the tables before. But now, They were different. Their eyes were no longer the empty, soulless orbs that had haunted him earlier. Now, their eyes were wide open, staring at him with an intensity that felt almost knowing, as if they understood something that he didn't. They were waiting. Mark hesitated, his feet rooted to the spot. He wanted to speak, to ask them what was going on, but his throat felt tight and the words wouldn't come. Instead, he simply stood there, staring at them, feeling a strange mixture of fear and curiosity welling up inside him. The silence stretched on, and Mark's mind raced. He had to understand. He had to know what was happening, why he was here, and why no one ever left this place. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could say anything, one of the figures, the man who had sat at the table near the back, stepped forward. "I'm sorry," the man said, his voice hoarse and strained, like someone who had not spoken in years. "But there's nothing you can do." Mark felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you mean? What is this place? What's going on?" The man's eyes were filled with sorrow, but also something else. Resignation. "This place is a prison," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "A place that feeds on the souls of those who walk through its doors. We're all trapped here, Mark, just like you, just like all the others before you." Mark's mind reeled. "But how? Why?" The man glanced around at the other diners, their faces a mixture of fear and despair. But none of them spoke. They simply stared, as if they had long ago given up on finding an answer. "Because it needs us," the man said, his voice growing weaker. "It feeds on our fear, our regrets, our darkest desires. It uses us to trap others, to feed the curse that keeps this place alive." Mark's throat tightened. "The curse? What curse?" The man took a deep breath, his gaze falling to the ground as though the weight of his words was too much to bear. "It was all started by the owner, the one who built this place. He wasn't just a restaurateur. He was a collector of souls, a man who sought to create a perfect, eternal experience. But in his greed and arrogance, he sealed his own fate and ours. Every soul that enters this place becomes part of its twisted reality. There is no escape." Mark's mind was spinning. He couldn't fathom it. A collector of souls? Eternal experience? "But why didn't anyone tell me?" Mark asked, his voice shaking. "Why didn't anyone warn me?" The man's expression grew even more sorrowful. "We couldn't. We were too far gone. Once the curse takes hold, it's impossible to break. We've all tried, over and over again, but every attempt only feeds the curse, makes it stronger." Mark's pulse quickened as he realized the true horror of his situation. He was trapped, just like them. There was no way out, no way to break the curse. Is there no hope?" Mark asked, his voice barely a whisper. The man looked at him, his face filled with pity. "You'll see," he said softly. "You'll understand soon enough. When it's your turn to serve the curse. When it's your turn to become a part of this place." Mark's heart sank into his stomach. He couldn't accept it. He wouldn't. There had to be something he could do. But before he could ask another question, the ground beneath his feet trembled, and a deep, ominous rumble echoed through the void. The diners froze, their faces blank again, as if they had been reset to their soulless state. The man who had spoken to Mark took a step back, his eyes wide with terror. "It's coming," the man whispered, his voice full of dread. "It's here." Mark turned to see a shadow rising from the darkness ahead. It was large, massive, like the silhouette of something ancient. something monstrous. The shape loomed closer, its presence casting an unbearable weight on the air around him. It was the same figure from before, the one that had warned him there was no escape. The figure's glowing eyes pierced through the darkness, locking onto Mark. It smiled, its lips curling into a twisted grin. "Welcome," it said, its voice like 1,000 whispers. "You are ready. You will join us now." Mark's blood ran cold as the realization sank in. He had been brought here for a reason. He had been chosen. And now there was no turning back. The curse had claimed him. Before he could react, the shadow reached out with its long, bony hand and grasped him, pulling him into the darkness. The last thing Mark saw, before everything went black, was the faces of the diners, watching him with eyes that no longer held any trace of humanity. They were gone, swallowed by the curse, just as he would be. And in that final moment, Mark understood. This was not just a restaurant. It was a place where souls were bound for eternity, where the living became part of the darkness, feeding the curse that could never be broken. The final door had closed. Mark's mind swirled with an unrelenting frenzy, as if the very fabric of reality had been torn apart, leaving him floating in a timeless abyss. His body was numb, disconnected from his senses, as though he was no longer fully aware of himself. The void around him had swallowed him whole, a cold, suffocating presence that clung to every inch of him. His skin felt like ice, and his breath came in ragged gasps, but there was no escape, no way out. The figure, the shadow that had grasped him, loomed over him like a nightmare made flesh. Its bony fingers dug into his arms, unyielding, its grip like the deathly embrace of the abyss itself. The world around Mark blurred, and for a moment he thought he was going to faint, that the darkness would take him entirely. And then, as if someone had flicked a switch, Mark was thrust back into the diner, sitting at the same table where it had all begun. The cold, familiar chill settled over him once more, and the smell of burnt coffee and stale bread assaulted his senses. He blinked rapidly, trying to shake off the confusion. His mind struggled to comprehend what had just happened. He had been there, in that endless void. He had felt it, he had known the truth, but now he was back in the diner, back at square one. For a moment, Mark simply sat there, frozen in place. His hands gripped the edge of the table so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He could hear the faint sounds of other patrons in the background, but their faces were all blurred, distant, as if they were just figures in a nightmare. And then, one by one, the diners began to turn and look at him, their eyes wide with silent recognition. Their expressions were emotionless, yet there was something haunting in their gazes. They all knew what had happened, and they were waiting. Mark stood up slowly, his legs shaking beneath him, his body unwilling to obey his commands. He staggered toward the door, each step feeling like it was dragging him deeper into some unending cursed abyss. His pulse raced, his mind screamed for him to escape, to break free from this hellish cycle. But the door wouldn't open. He pulled on the handle, but it was stuck, locked, as if mocking him. He shoved against it with all his might, his chest heaving, his hands slick with sweat, but the door didn't budge. The diner's hum of quiet conversation faded into nothingness, replaced by a haunting, unnerving silence. Mark's heart pounded in his chest, the sound deafening in his ears. He could feel the weight of the diner's gazes upon him, watching, waiting for him to give up. He could feel the presence of the curse growing stronger, suffocating him, pulling him deeper into its grasp. "Let me out," he screamed, his voice raw with desperation, but no one responded. The diners simply stared, their eyes empty, as if they had long ago accepted the inevitability of their fate. Mark fell to his knees, overwhelmed by the crushing realization that he was trapped. The diner, the shadowy figure, the endless void, everything was part of the same cursed cycle. He was no different from the others, no different from the souls who had entered this place, only to become trapped within it forever. He had thought he was different. He had thought he could break free. But now he understood. There was no escape. Not for him. Not for anyone. A soft, almost imperceptible sound broke through the silence. The sound of footsteps approaching. Mark looked up, his breath hitching in his throat, his heart racing. The figure was back. The shadow that had claimed him, pulling him into the depths of that void, was now standing before him once again. This time, however, it wasn't the same. The figure's form was clearer now, more solid, more defined. Its glowing eyes pierced the darkness, an eerie, unsettling glow that filled Mark's vision. Its smile stretched wider, a grotesque expression that seemed to mock him. "You're ready now," the figure said, its voice like 1,000 whispers overlapping one another. It sounded both ancient and modern, like the voice of time itself. "You're part of the cycle now. The diner has chosen you, and just like everyone else before you, you will serve it, forever." Mark's blood ran cold as he tried to stand, but his legs refused to carry him. He was paralyzed, unable to move, unable to escape. The weight of the figure's gaze was unbearable, as if it could see into the very depths of his soul, uncovering all his darkest fears and regrets. "Please," Mark whispered, his voice cracking with desperation. "I don't want this. I don't want to be part of this. I just want to leave. Let me go." The figure tilted its head slightly, as if considering him. Then it spoke again, its voice a soft, cruel sigh. "It's too late for that. The moment you walked through the door, you became part of the diner's curse. You became part of its cycle. There is no way out." Tears welled in Mark's eyes as the hopelessness of the situation washed over him. He had been wrong. The diner wasn't just a place. It was a force, a curse that consumed everything in its path. The shadows, the figures, the endless void. It was all connected, all part of the same cruel, unrelenting cycle. "You're not the first," the figure continued. "There have been countless others before you. Each one, like you, thought they could escape, but none of them did. And none of them ever will." Mark's mind reeled, his thoughts racing. He remembered the man who had spoken to him earlier, the one who had warned him. His face was clear in his mind now, his eyes filled with sorrow, but also with something else. Resignation. The diners in the room, were they once like him? Had they all been trapped here, just like he had? Were they once struggling to break free, to escape this endless cycle, only to lose in the end? Mark looked around, his heart sinking further with each passing second. The diners weren't just patrons. They were like him now, trapped in this hellish loop, forever bound to serve the curse. Their faces had been blank, hollow, but now, in the shadow of the figure, their eyes gleamed with a strange understanding. They were all in this together, but it wasn't solidarity. It was acceptance. Mark felt his grip on reality slipping. The walls around him blurred again. and the diner faded into the darkness. The shadow figure's voice rang out one last time, its tone like the toll of a bell. Welcome to your eternity. The last thing Mark saw was the figure's smile, stretching wider, as the diner swallowed him whole once again